Imagine a gang of thieves pulling off the biggest bank heist in U.S. history. The whole operation was done with the highest level of precision and professionalism. The smart and complex steps they took showed that these thieves were on a completely different level. So, how could such a group of professional and meticulous thieves end up getting caught? Is it even possible that such smart thieves could get busted over some trivial mistakes? That's what we're going to find out in today's story. What's up, everybody? It's Shamsi Dine. Our story takes place in Los Angeles, California, back in 1972. About 50 years ago, to be exact, on Monday, March 27th. The manager of a large branch of the United California Bank headed to work as usual to open the bank vault. But when he tried to unlock the vault door, it wouldn't budge. The handle, which was the kind that needed to be turned to move the gears inside the massive steel door, just wouldn't move, no matter how much the manager tried. Employees gathered around the door, and a few of them gave it a shot, but it was no use. The door was stuck. The next step was to call the vault manufacturer, since they were responsible for its maintenance. A technician arrived about 20 minutes after the call and started inspecting the vault and its lock, trying to figure out why the door wouldn't open. He kept at it for hours, but nothing worked. The combination was correct, the lock was in place, and everything appeared normal on the surface. There was no clear reason why the vault door was jammed. Then, the technician suggested they check the space above the vault, the small area between the bank ceiling and the top of the vault, where wooden beams, ventilation ducts, and electrical wiring passed through. Now, the vault ceiling was a thick, reinforced concrete slab. Imagine the technician's shock when he saw a large hole in the vault ceiling, with another hole in the bank's roof right above it. At that moment, the technician knew the vault had been robbed and that the thief or thieves had drilled a hole in the bank's roof, and then another one in the thick, reinforced concrete ceiling of the vault. Immediately, the technician climbed down into the vault through the hole. The first thing he noticed was the thick layer of dust covering everything inside the vault. And, of course, everything was flipped upside down. The shelves, the bags, the safe deposit boxes. It was obvious the place had been ransacked. When the technician checked the vault door from the inside, he quickly saw that a screwdriver had been wedged between the gears to stop the door from opening. It was clear that the thieves did this to delay the discovery of the robbery for as long as possible. So, the technician removed the screwdriver from its spot, and they were able to open the vault door right away. The bank immediately called the police, and the officers and detectives arrived, went inside the vault, and started examining the place. The vault was turned upside down, and everything had been looted. The scene was a complete mess, with a lot of things scattered all over the floor. Watches, rings, pictures, documents, and plenty of other belongings from the safe deposit boxes. Of course, the thieves tried to take the most valuable items and left behind things that either had little or no value. The detectives knew that sorting through the scene and figuring out the total loss and what was stolen would take a lot of time and effort. They also had to figure out how these thieves managed to break into a vault that was supposed to be incredibly secure and reinforced from every angle. The first thing they noticed when they examined the debris around the hole was that the concrete dust was mixed with some other strange materials, which were likely construction materials or stuff used in the vault ceiling's cement. Among these materials, there was black powdery residue and large torn pieces of burlap cloth scattered around different parts of the vault. The black powder was likely leftover gunpowder, but the bigger mystery for the investigators was how the vault's alarms didn't go off when the thieves broke in. The vault had several alarm systems. The first one was a large bell mounted on the outer wall of the bank, and it was supposed to ring loudly if the alarm system detected any intruders. But when they opened up the bell's casing, they found it covered with a solid white substance that kept it from moving or making any sound. They also found a metal ladder propped up near the bank wall. With all this evidence, the investigators were able to put together a pretty clear picture of how the thieves broke into the bank. The first thing they did was unlock the bell's casing, then sprayed it with liquid styrofoam. This material is used in construction, and once it's out of the can, it starts to harden. When it's solidified, it froze the bell hammer in place, stopping it from moving, so the bell never rang. After that, they brought in a long metal ladder and climbed up to the roof of the bank, carrying their gear and tools for drilling and cutting. They used an extension cord from the building itself to power their tools. They had a long cable, which made it easy for them to connect their equipment to the electricity. After that, they drilled the first hole in the bank's roof, which wasn't too strong or heavily reinforced. Once they got through the roof and broke into the bank, they reached the small area between the bank ceiling and the vault ceiling. But, like we said, the vault ceiling was much tougher since it was thick concrete reinforced with steel. Before they started working on the vault ceiling, though, there was another alarm system directly above the vault. This system was silent, and if it detected any breach, it was supposed to send a direct signal to the police. But the thieves knew about this alarm, even though it was hidden, and only the bank management and police were supposed to know about it, which meant these thieves had planned the whole thing down to the finest detail. It was obvious one of them was an expert with alarm systems, because after the investigators checked the alarm, they found that the thieves had cut the wires that were supposed to trigger the police signal, and then they soldered the wires in a way that prevented any signal from being sent. In other words, these thieves were top-level professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't just any ordinary heist. It was a meticulous operation that required high-level skills. But even after disabling the alarm, now the toughest challenge they faced was the vault's concrete ceiling, which was 40 centimeters thick and reinforced with steel. How could they break through it? Drilling through that would take days, maybe even weeks, even with the best tools and drilling equipment. That's where the team's explosives expert came in. The thieves drilled small holes into the ceiling and placed sticks of dynamite in them. It was a really smart move, probably the only way they could make a hole in such a strong ceiling. But after the explosion, the blast had to be directed downward so it wouldn't hurt the thieves or attract attention. The investigators figured out that the thieves brought burlap sacks full of sand with them, and they brought a lot of them. They placed these sacks over the explosives and the dynamite holes, sealing them tight. So when they set off the dynamite, the sacks directed the blast downward, and all the force went straight into the vault ceiling. An added benefit was that the sound didn't carry outside. Even after blowing up the ceiling and creating a hole, the explosion didn't break through the steel reinforcements inside the concrete. But the thieves knew that was going to happen, and they came prepared. They brought an acetylene torch with them, the kind blacksmiths use to cut through steel. Using this torch, they were able to cut through the steel reinforcements. These thieves were prepared for everything, knowing every step and every tool they needed, without missing a single detail. The operation was planned with such high-level professionalism and precision, which amazed and shocked the investigators more than anything else. Now that the detectives knew how the thieves broke into the vault, they began looking for any traces they might have left behind. But they knew that thieves who pulled off an operation this precise wouldn't leave any evidence behind. And sure enough, after inspecting the scene several times, they didn't find any fingerprints, DNA, or any trace they could use. The only thing they found was a glove that seemed to belong to one of the thieves, and a drill bit, but none of these items had any usable clues or evidence. The next step was to assess the amount of what had been stolen. The bank reported that $50,000 in cash was missing from the vault, but that amount was trivial compared to the valuable items stored in the safe deposit boxes. It was clear the thieves had forcibly opened these boxes. Since the robbery took place over the weekend, the thieves had plenty of time to open the boxes, search through them, and sort the contents. Naturally, they took the most valuable items and left behind things that weren't worth much, like photos or documents, items that were probably important to the box owners but had no financial value for the thieves. Of course, the bank had no idea what was inside those boxes, since only the box owners knew what they had stored. So the police had to conduct interviews with each of the owners to assess the losses. These boxes were filled with jewelry, watches, bonds, and even cash. After interviewing dozens of box owners, the police estimated that the total value of the stolen items was around $8 million. This meant it was the largest bank robbery in U.S. history at the time. Bigger heists have happened since then, but back then, this was the biggest one. Now, imagine the detectives were dealing with the biggest bank robbery in American history, and they had no evidence or leads to follow. They started thinking, what can we do? The first thing that came to mind was trying to trace the tools the thieves used. From analyzing the crime scene, they knew most of the tools the thieves had used: large drills, cables, sandbags, dynamite, and welding tools. So the police started going to local stores that might sell those kinds of tools or materials used in the heist. They asked shop owners about any recent purchases that seemed suspicious, but this attempt failed. They didn't find anything useful. The investigators were stumped. They didn't know what to do. There were no clues, no witnesses, and no suspects. It seemed like these thieves had pulled off the perfect heist, one that couldn't be solved. So at this point, the case was handed over to the FBI. And when the FBI takes a case, that means the criminals are in big trouble. As soon as the FBI investigators learned the details of the robbery, they immediately realized they were dealing with professional thieves with a lot of experience. But this was the first bank robbery of this level of sophistication in Los Angeles. The only conclusion they could come to was that these thieves came from another state or city. The first thing the FBI office in LA did was send a message to the other FBI offices across the United States. This message outlined the details of the robbery and asked if any other offices had dealt with similar operations or robberies that were as professional. A reply came quickly from the FBI office in Ohio, stating that they were investigating 13 similar robberies to the one that took place in Los Angeles. The investigators in the Ohio office, once they heard the details of the robbery, like using styrofoam to freeze the alarm bell, breaking into the bank through the roof, bypassing the silent alarm, and using explosives, realized that these details were very similar to the robberies they were investigating in Ohio. The FBI office in Ohio believed that the ones responsible for these robberies were actually a large gang connected to organized crime and the mafia based out of Youngstown, Ohio. So, the LA investigators were right. This gang specialized in bank heists. Ohio's office already had a big list of around 100 people who worked in this gang. The gang was massive, with different teams and crews. Each team had its own jobs, but sometimes they worked together and shared their expertise. They had people skilled in everything from drilling to electrical work, blacksmithing, tech, and explosives. Every skill they needed for these operations was available within the gang. Depending on the operation and its needs, a specialized team or crew could be formed to carry out a particular heist. Now, the big question was, if the FBI in Ohio had all this info about the gang members, why hadn't they arrested them yet? The simple answer was that there was no solid evidence. They couldn't press charges based on the investigations or the intelligence they had gathered. The Ohio FBI office was confident that the gang responsible for the LA bank robbery was part of this larger organized group they were tracking. So, they sent over a list of the gang members to the FBI office in LA. The list included names and photos of all the known gang members. Since the gang's base was in Ohio, it was likely they flew to LA because the distance between Ohio and LA is over 2,200 miles, and it would have been nearly impossible to drive that far. Their task now was to cross-reference the names of the gang members with the passenger lists of flights from Ohio to LA in the period leading up to the robbery. This was an incredibly tedious task because there were no computers back then. This was 1972, after all. They had to go through the lists manually, and after a lot of effort, they finally identified 6 gang members who had entered Los Angeles shortly before the robbery. Those individuals were Emil Dinzio, his brother James Dinzio, their relative Charles Mulligan, Philip Christopher, Charles Brockle, and Harry Barber. They numbered them from 1 to 6 to make them easier to track. All of the gang members had prior criminal records for things like burglaries and small-time store break-ins. They had all done short stints in jail throughout their lives, but none had been caught for a major robbery or served any significant prison time. As for suspect number 1, Emil Dinzio, it seemed like he was the leader and mastermind behind the heist. He was the one who picked the rest of the crew, even bringing along some of his relatives. Number 2 was named James Dinzio, and he was actually the older brother. Number 3 was Charles Mulligan, who was actually their brother-in-law, married to their sister. These two didn't have any specialized skills, and their job was most likely manual labor. As for number 4, Philip Christopher, he had skills in surveillance and scouting, and he was probably in charge of keeping watch and making sure no one was watching them during the job, especially since the bank robbery they pulled off took place over the entire weekend, stretching through Saturday and Sunday. They went in and out of the vault multiple times, and this required surveillance. That was likely Philip Christopher's role. Now, number 5, Charles Brockle, was the most important member of the crew. This guy was an expert in electronics and explosives, and he was responsible for disabling the alarm systems and also for planting the explosives. The last guy, number 6, was Harry Barber, who was actually the nephew of the leader, Emil, meaning his job was probably more physical labor too. All 6 of these guys arrived in Los Angeles shortly before the robbery, making them the prime suspects in the case. The problem now was that investigators didn't know where to look for them. The only idea they had was to go to the airport and ask cab drivers if they had seen any of them, because it was likely that the suspects used a taxi after leaving the airport. The detectives started interviewing all the cab drivers who were working at the airport on that day. This was a huge operation and took several days, as they questioned dozens of drivers. But in the end, their hard work paid off. One cab driver, after seeing the photos shown to him by the detectives, said that a group of 5 guys who looked just like the ones in the pictures had ridden with him that day. He remembered the trip clearly because they gave him a $100 tip, which was, of course, a huge tip at the time. Plus, their whole vibe made him uneasy. They really did seem like a gang. The cab driver gave the address where he had dropped them off, which was a house in one of the suburbs. The investigators were worried that the suspects might flee the city if they found out they were being tracked, but after some thought, they realized they had no choice but to head to that house. It was the only lead they had, so they decided to go for it. When they arrived, they knocked on the door, and a guy opened up. After introducing themselves and asking a few questions, they figured out that the house belonged to the Barber family, and the person they were talking to was Ronald Barber, the younger brother of Harry Barber, suspect number 6 we mentioned earlier. The detectives didn't have a search warrant or anything, so they couldn't enter or search the house. However, they asked Ronald Barber if he'd be willing to answer some questions, and Ronald agreed. But despite agreeing, it was clear he was dodging and weaving with his answers, often saying, "I don't know," or giving unclear responses. When they asked him about the 6 gang members, he said they had come to the house but didn't stay long, as each of them went off to handle their own business. When they asked what kind of business they had, he replied, "I don't know." After they finished questioning him, the detectives thanked Ronald Barber for his cooperation and left. Even though they were sure he was lying to them about some things, they did believe him when he said the 6 hadn't stayed at the house, which probably meant they went to a hotel, maybe even different hotels. The detectives' first instinct was to check the hotels near the bank. They began visiting every upscale hotel in the area, but their search didn't turn up anything, until one of the detectives decided to think differently. Maybe these thieves didn't stay in fancy hotels. Maybe they chose regular or even low-end motels to avoid drawing attention. This detective started checking out these types of motels one by one. Finally, his efforts paid off when he walked into a small roadside motel typically used by truck drivers. When the detective showed pictures of the suspects to the front desk clerk, the clerk recognized Emil Dincio, the gang leader, and his brother-in-law, Charles Mulligan. He told them that these 2 had stayed at the motel. When the detective asked about the timing, he found out it was around the same time as the bank robbery. The detective then asked the clerk to show him the registration log that they filled out when they checked in. Immediately, the detective noticed that Emil Dincio had used a license plate number on the paperwork. When they ran that plate, they discovered it belonged to Ronald Barber, the nephew of the guy they interviewed when they showed up at the house, the brother of suspect number 6, Harry Barber. So, Ronald Barber was added as the 7th suspect in the case, joining his brother Harry Barber on the list of suspects. The FBI investigators were almost certain that these 7 were responsible for the robbery, but they didn't have hard evidence they could use against them in court. Everything they had was circumstantial and speculative, so they needed a new lead to follow. This is where the FBI made a very crucial move, though at first they didn't think it would lead to anything. That move was to ask the telecommunications company for the call records from the room the suspects had stayed in at the motel. The investigators didn't expect to find anything useful because the thieves, especially Emil, were likely cautious and wouldn't use traceable phones. But it seemed Emil didn't expect the investigators to track them down to the motel they stayed at and thought they had covered their tracks well. In reality, Emil had used the motel room phone to make several calls. You might be wondering why he didn't use his cell phone. Well, let me remind you. We're talking about 1972. There were no cell phones back then. When the list of calls from the motel room reached the detectives, they noticed one important number that Emil had called frequently, and it was a local number in Los Angeles. When they traced this number, they found out it belonged to a man named Earl Dassin. After investigating Earl Dassin, they discovered that he was a former soldier in the Special Forces and an expert in explosives. Since the thieves had used explosives in the robbery, the detectives began to suspect that he might be involved with them. Sure, they already had an explosives expert, Charles Brockle, but maybe Earl Dassin was the one who supplied them with the explosives. However, after digging deeper into Dassin's background and life, they started to feel it was unlikely. His record was clean, and he seemed like a patriotic guy. His life was stable and comfortable, meaning he didn't have a need to get involved in gang activity and robberies. The detectives decided to go to his house and confront him directly about the situation. When they arrived at his house and knocked on the door, he opened it. After introducing themselves, they asked if they could have a conversation with him, and Earl Dassin agreed and invited them inside. Right away, the detectives began talking about the situation. They showed him pictures and names of the suspects and asked him directly about his connection to them. At first, Dassin was a bit hesitant to talk. The detectives knew he had served in the military and special forces, so one of the detectives, who was also a former Special Forces officer, tried to relate to him through a sense of patriotism and military service. Sure enough, this seemed to hit home with Dassen and got him talking. Dassen asked the detective, "What's going on? Why are you looking for these people?" The detective responded, "Have you heard about the big bank robbery that happened a few weeks ago? That's what we're here to talk about." Dassen took the photos of the suspects in front of him, pointed to 3 of them, and said he knew those 3, Emil Dincio, his brother James Dincio, and their brother-in-law Charles Mulligan. He knew Charles Mulligan in particular because they were friends and had a strong connection from back when he lived in Ohio, specifically in Youngstown, which is the center of this gang. Dassen decided to tell the detectives everything he knew. He said that, the day before the robbery, Charles Mulligan knocked on his door with 6 other people, the same 6 that were in the photos in front of him. Mulligan offered Dassen $100 to leave the house so they could have their meeting inside. Dassen agreed, took the $100, and left the house, not hearing anything about what they discussed. Then, Dassen surprised the detectives even more when he told them he had something important he wanted them to see. The detectives asked him what it was, and he said that Mulligan had left a car in his garage and that it was still there. The detectives were excited, feeling like they finally had some solid evidence in the case. But before they could gather the evidence and examine the car, suddenly, the house phone rang. Dassen got up to answer the call, and when he picked up the phone, he heard Mulligan's voice on the other end. Right away, Dassen started signaling to the detectives, moving his hands as if to say, "It's Mulligan on the phone." The detectives immediately understood, and Dassen pointed toward a second phone in the bedroom. One of the detectives quickly ran to the bedroom, picked up the other phone, and could hear the entire conversation clearly. He had to remain completely silent, so Mulligan wouldn't catch on. The detective continued listening in complete silence, covering the part of the phone that makes noise. Mulligan was asking Dassen over the phone, "Have any FBI agents come by or reached out to you?" Dassen replied, "No, no one from the FBI has come around." At that moment, the detective knew for sure that Dassen was on their side and would help them catch this gang. Mulligan continued by telling Dassen that the FBI had started asking questions about him and his crew and were tracking the places they had been. He said he was getting nervous and needed Dassen to tell him if anything happened or if any FBI agent or investigator came near him. Dassen reassured him, saying that he definitely wouldn't say anything and that he would get in touch with him right away if any investigators tried to approach him or interrogate him. Then Mulligan told Dassen, "I want to see you tonight so we can talk a bit. And after that, I might pick up the car I left in your garage." At that moment, the detective listening to the call began to feel uneasy. He started suspecting that Mulligan might be setting a trap for Dassen. Maybe Mulligan wanted to kidnap him, kill him, or do something to him. It was even possible that Mulligan was watching the house from outside and had already seen the detectives' cars parked out front. This phone call might be a test for Dassen. The detective thought quickly and decided the meeting had to take place in a public location. He grabbed a piece of paper and wrote on it, "Meet him in a public place," then handed the paper to Dassen while he was still on the phone with Mulligan. Dassen told Mulligan he would meet him at his favorite restaurant, a place called the Walnut Room, and gave him the location. Mulligan agreed to the spot and then ended the call. After the call, the detectives asked Dassen to take them to the garage, where they found the car that Mulligan had left. But the detectives couldn't search the car or forcibly open it because they didn't have a search warrant. Even if they thought about forcing the car open and searching it, they realized that doing so would make any evidence they found inside unusable in court. So, they had to get a search warrant from a judge. However, through the car window, the detectives clearly saw 2 black gloves that looked exactly like the one they had found in the bank vault. That alone was enough to get the judge to issue a search warrant for the car. They quickly got the search warrant, as well as an arrest warrant for Charles Mulligan. The plan was to arrest him when he met Dassin at the restaurant. That night, Dassin went to the Walnut Room, the restaurant where he and Mulligan had agreed to meet. The detectives were also there, dressed in plain clothes, blending in with the other customers, and watching Dassin closely from a distance. 4 detectives were inside the restaurant, and 2 others were stationed outside, all ready to step in if anything went wrong. Their top priority was Dassin's safety. They told Dassin that if he needed anything, he could go to the bathroom, and one of them would follow him there to see what he needed. The same would apply if one of the detectives went to the bathroom. Dassin should follow to receive any updates from them. They all had the plan in place and sat at different tables. About an hour later, Mulligan arrived at the restaurant. He went straight to Dassin, greeted him, and then they sat down and began talking. During their conversation, the subject of the robbery came up. Dassin asked Mulligan directly, "So, you had a hand in that big robbery, huh?" Mulligan laughed and said, "What do you think?" "Just think about it." They continued talking for a while, but the detectives couldn't clearly hear what was being said. One of the detectives got up and headed to the bathroom, and Dassin understood that this was a signal for him to follow. Dassin excused himself to Mulligan, telling him he'd be right back after using the restroom. In the bathroom, Dassin met with the detective and told him what had happened so far. "We didn't talk about anything major," Dassin said. "We talked about the robbery, but he didn't admit to anything directly, and now he's in a hurry to go pick up the car from the garage." The detective told Dassin, "Okay, go ahead and leave with him, but don't get in the car with him or let him take you to a secluded place. We'll keep watching and follow you closely." The detective didn't tell Dassin that they planned to arrest Mulligan as soon as they left the restaurant. Dassin returned to the table and told Mulligan, "Let's go back to the house and get your car." They both left the restaurant and started walking down the street toward the house. In an instant, FBI agents and detectives surrounded them, quickly arresting Mulligan. They also arrested Dassin for concealing his cooperation with them. Mulligan didn't resist the arrest, but when the detectives tried to question him, he refused to say anything. Now that the detectives had Mulligan in custody, they set him aside and focused on the car he had left in Dassin's garage. They began searching the car, and as soon as they opened the trunk, they found a large drill and various digging tools, along with hammers, drill bits, and other items. They were almost certain that these tools had been used in the robbery. The detectives cataloged everything they found in the car and sent the evidence to the labs for analysis. At that point, the detectives felt triumphant, thinking they had hit a gold mine of evidence. But they also knew that analyzing these tools would take time. The lab technicians and forensic experts needed several days to examine everything thoroughly. While the tools were being examined, the detectives decided to follow up on other leads. Remember those phone records they pulled from the hotel room phone, which led them to Dassin? One of the numbers in those records belonged to a real estate agency. The detectives contacted the agency and asked them about the gang members. The agency's manager told the detectives that she had rented an apartment to Ronald Barber a few weeks before the robbery. Ronald Barber was a member of the gang and was already in Los Angeles. He hadn't come from out of town. He was the one who rented the apartment before the rest of the gang arrived. The apartment was on the same street as the bank. The manager told the detectives that Ronald had said he planned to stay in the apartment for 3 months, but they left after just 3 weeks. When the detectives checked the date they moved out, they realized it was the same day the robbery was discovered, meaning they had left immediately after pulling off the heist. The investigators immediately started searching the apartment for any traces or evidence the gang members might have left behind. But if we know anything about this gang, It's that they're meticulous and don't leave any traces. Indeed, the apartment looked spotless, and even the surfaces seemed like they had been wiped down with chemicals. There wasn't anything in the apartment that could lead to the gang members until the investigators opened the dishwasher. It was full, but none of the dishes or cups inside had been washed. The gang members didn't bother turning it on, and all forgot to press the start button. Since the dishes were hidden inside the dishwasher, no one noticed them before they left. This dishwasher turned out to be a gold mine for the investigators. They were able to lift fingerprints from the used dishes and cups and sent those prints to the lab. When the lab technicians compared them to the prints and traces found on the drilling tools recovered from Mulligan's car, they discovered a match. They were able to prove that these fingerprints belonged to 5 of the 7 suspects. Another thing, tool experts managed to match the hammer found in Mulligan's car to the marks on the safety deposit boxes in the vault, proving that this hammer was one of the tools used to break into the safety deposit boxes in the bank's vault. Of course, all of this was circumstantial evidence, but it was enough to arrest the suspects and start interrogating them. One of these suspects, Charles Mulligan, was already in custody. So now, the investigators had to apprehend the other 6 and also gather solid evidence to fully incriminate them, as circumstantial evidence alone wouldn't be enough. The case still heavily relied on the cooperation and testimony of Earl Dawson, as the meeting had been held at his house and the car was left in his garage. Dawson was the key witness. With Mulligan's arrest and the car being found by the FBI, the rest of the gang surely knew that the FBI was after them and that Dawson was cooperating with them. Indeed, Dawson began receiving threatening calls and pressure to stay silent and not talk. Dawson didn't know exactly who these people were that were threatening him, but the caller insisted on meeting him face to face to discuss the matter. FBI investigators quickly realized that the goal of this meeting wasn't just to talk, but the gang likely planned to eliminate Dawson and his testimony. In fact, the investigators received intel from their sources within the larger gang that hitmen had been hired to take Dawson out. As mentioned before, this smaller gang of 7 that robbed the bank was part of a larger gang with ties to organized crime and the mafia. These gangs don't show mercy and eliminate witnesses or informants who cooperate with the police without hesitation or compromise. The FBI understood that the purpose of the meeting requested by the unknown caller was to kill Dawson. It was crucial to protect Dawson by any means necessary because he was their informant and key witness in the case. So, the investigators instructed Dawson to arrange a meeting with the caller at the same restaurant where he had previously met Mulligan, but they didn't tell Dawson that the gang planned to kill him. They wanted to confront the hitmen and send a message to the gang that they were being watched. The plan was for the investigators to be present in the restaurant, watching everything, and they were confident they could protect Dawson no matter what happened, especially since they knew the hitmen wouldn't dare kill Dawson in a public or open place. They would try to lure him to a secluded spot. The investigators gave Dawson strict instructions not to leave with these people or to leave the restaurant under any circumstances. The agreement was that if the investigators or Dawson needed to communicate, the bathroom would be their meeting place. A short while later, the hitmen, or potential hitmen, arrived, 2 of them, and headed straight for Dawson. The investigators closely monitored the situation. These 2 men started offering Dawson strong alcoholic drinks, and it was clear their goal was to get him drunk. When the investigators noticed Dawson becoming nervous and agitated, one of them got up and went to the bathroom, which was the signal for Dawson to follow him. Dawson excused himself from the 2 men he was sitting with and headed to the bathroom. There, he met with the investigator and anxiously told him that these 2 men wanted to take him somewhere. The investigator replied, "Don't worry, we won't let them take you anywhere. Stay here and we'll handle them." The detective came out of the bathroom, brought the other detectives with him, and confronted the two men, saying, "We know why you're here and what your goal is, and now it's time for you to leave." It was a direct confrontation, and the two men had no reaction. They simply stood up and left the restaurant without any argument or words. This was a clear message to the gang that Dawson was under FBI protection, and no matter what they tried, they wouldn't be able to get to him. But of course, that wasn't enough. To fully protect Dawson, he needed to be placed in the Witness Protection Program. The Witness Protection Program is a federal program designed to protect witnesses who are targeted by hitmen or gangs they've testified against. The federal government takes the witness, gives them a completely new identity, changes their name and documents, and relocates them to a new city far from their previous home. They are given a new house and life, making it impossible for the gang or criminals who were after them to find them. This program is extremely important in America because without it, many witnesses, or even criminals who want to turn on their crews and gangs, wouldn't have the courage to testify against them. They're too scared of being killed or retaliated against. So, Earl Dawson was placed in this program to protect him from being targeted by the gang, and of course, he remained the key witness in the case. The next step was for the FBI to arrest the remaining suspected gang members. After gathering all the evidence, they had search and arrest warrants allowing them to go after these suspects. They started tracking down the last known locations or homes where these suspects had been living. All of their homes were in Ohio, specifically in the city of Youngstown. The FBI arrived at their homes and began searching them. During this search, they received intel from their sources or informants within the gang that in many of their heists, the thieves would take the money and bury it underground, leaving it there for a long time, sometimes for years, until the heat from the investigation died down. After that, they'd dig up the money and start laundering it. The FBI arrived at a large plot of land owned by James Denzio, the second in command of the gang and the older brother of the gang leader, Emil Denzio. They had a strong suspicion that the loot might be buried on this land, so they began searching. They brought in backhoes and even rented excavators and started digging up the property. The operation went on for more than a week, and finally, after all the time and effort, they found what they were looking for. Buried beneath the ground were black boxes, and when they opened them, they found millions of dollars inside, cash and financial bonds. These boxes didn't just contain the loot from the Los Angeles bank heist, but also loot from their previous robberies. This was confirmed through the serial numbers on the money. As we mentioned before, this gang had been operating for a long time, and before the Los Angeles bank robbery, they had robbed about 13 banks in Ohio. So, imagine, just in one blow, the investigators were able to recover most of the loot from all these heists. And even better, they found fingerprints on the boxes. This gave the FBI solid evidence they needed to prosecute these thieves. Finally, after this complex investigation that lasted for 3 straight months, they were able to tighten their grip on the 7 suspects and had strong evidence to bring them to trial. As for the leader, Emil Denzio, when they went to his house, they found him sitting there like nothing had happened. He didn't try to run or hide, even though he knew they were coming for him, according to one of the detectives. If this shows anything, it's Emil's arrogant and overconfident personality, thinking he's above the law and can control things however he wants. Anyway, Emil Denzio was arrested without any trouble. The rest of the gang, however, each tried to run or hide in their own way. James Denzio, Emil's brother, was arrested at the airport trying to flee with a bag full of the stolen money. They also arrested Vlad Christopher, the 4th member of the team, and found over $30,000 of the stolen cash in his apartment. Now, With 4 of them arrested, all of them insisted they were innocent and refused to cooperate with the detectives. But what they didn't know was that they were about to be betrayed. After some time, the police managed to catch the 5th thief, Charles Brackles, the electronics and explosives expert. The detectives kept pressuring him, showing him the evidence they had, and told him they could put him away for a long time. Under this pressure, Charles Brackles decided to turn on his crew, testifying against them and confessing all the details of the operation, in exchange for having all charges dropped and being placed in the witness protection program so the gang wouldn't retaliate against him. And that's exactly what happened. With Charles Brackles' testimony, the case against the gang was fully complete. Now, 5 of the 7 were in prison, and the remaining 2 were the brothers Harry Barber and Ronald Barber. When the police first went to their home, they didn't find them. When they asked their mother, she said she hadn't seen or spoken to them in a long time. It was clear the brothers had fled and gone into hiding. Despite that, the authorities went ahead and prosecuted the arrested members, while the brothers remained on the run. But a few months later, the FBI received a tip that the brothers were living in an apartment in New York. The police went to that apartment, and when they knocked on the door, Ronald Barber answered and was immediately arrested and sent to Los Angeles. All of the gang members who were caught received sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years, which weren't harsh since the robbery didn't involve violence, and most of the stolen money had been recovered. As for the last thief, Harry Barber, his brother refused to reveal his location. For 8 years, Harry remained on the run, evading justice. But in 1980, a woman from Pennsylvania contacted the FBI and told them that one of her friends was living with a man who claimed to have been part of a big famous robbery in Los Angeles, and that his real name was Harry Barber. She told the detectives that the man seemed to be trying to live a normal, straight life, working in building maintenance. The police acted quickly, tracked him down, and found that this man was indeed Harry Barber, the man they had been searching for 8 years. He was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison. With that, the FBI was finally able to close the case. One of the FBI investigators said the reason the gang got caught was their overconfidence, having pulled off so many successful heists before this one. Even though they were meticulous and professional in many details, this time they made small but stupid mistakes that led to their capture. The first mistake was tipping the taxi driver too much, making them memorable to him. Then they used the hotel phone, allowing the detectives to trace their calls. Another thing was leaving their car and tools at Dawson's house. And, of course, on top of all that, they forgot to run the dishwasher. All these small mistakes, when put together, created a trail of clues that the detectives smartly followed to solve the case. This was the biggest bank robbery in American history at that time. And who knows, maybe in the future, we'll make a video talking about the biggest robbery in American history, which took place in 1997, 25 years after the heist we covered in today's story. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. And here are some more great videos you can watch. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one, and take care.